Hello, very beautiful community. Was there a Joe Biden cover up? A cover up around Joe Biden's cognitive health? I don't care, quite frankly, to get us too deeply into that specific conversation as much as I care to use it to go to the core of what it means for us to be losing or not losing trust in each other and in institutions and in democracy. So I'm going to just cross my fingers and hope my health lasts the 15, 20 minutes I want us to be here. And you can tuck yourself in and just see how you go. This is a conversation that I've myself interfered with a tiny bit in the public sphere over the last few years. It's also, I think, a positive conversation for me to have with you for two reasons. One's that I'm a political philosopher, but the second is that I've myself gone through cognitive decline. And the other really important reason is that I'm entirely capable, and philosophers are supposed to be better at this, so this is not always the case, at saying very negative things about people toward whom I'm positively disposed, and saying very positive things toward people I'm negatively disposed toward. What I don't want us to do, because it's not going to help you, and you've got this sort of diet, you can fulfill it elsewhere, is talk about individuals and who is responsible. Richetti, Donlan, Bernal. We're not going to have that kind of conversation. We're going to have a conversation about what went wrong, what it means for your democracy, even if you're not in the United States, because we've got a crisis of trust everywhere. We'll try to, I think, take away some lessons from this. So the first question I've asked myself here that I want to discuss with you is, how bad was it? Like, what the hell was actually happening? My own view, which is actually on YouTube, was that it was unethical for Biden to run in 2020 because of cognitive decline. Running on cognitive decline and governing with cognitive decline in an age with a raging crisis of trust is a very dangerous enterprise for democracy. I thought that it was unethical of Biden to run, but then I thought that Biden won largely because of the public health crisis and Trump's mismanagement of the public health crisis. Had that not taken place, I don't see how Biden could have won in 2020. When I talk about things like this, well, Biden would have won, Bernie would have lost, Bernie would have won, Trump would have lost, Trump would have won. I'm making evaluative judgments, but they are of less epistemic weight than more comprehensive judgments I make about whether our democracy is in decline or what the value of political freedom is. So understand that there's a spectrum of weightiness when claims are made. And when I make claims about hypothetical election outcomes, what I'm saying carries weight, but it doesn't carry as much weight relative to what's said down the pub as other more comprehensive judgments I might make. That's an important footnote. Throughout the discourse of the Biden insiders with the world and between themselves, there was a typically repeated distinction between the theatrics of the presidency and the actual functioning of the presidency. And the message was always, look, Joe can't do the theatrics like he could earlier. And he really could do them. I mean, look at the way only in 2012, Biden blew away Paul Ryan in the vice presidential debate. Look at the very last few months, actually, of Biden still performing very strongly cognitively. And you see the 2016 Democratic Convention speech for Hillary Clinton that Biden did, which is not just a brilliant speech, but probably one of the best speeches in the American politics in the 21st century. If you're interested in Biden's decline, watch that. That's one of the last markers of Biden at his very best. But that distinction was made. Yes, he's no longer good at the theatrics, but he is actually good at meetings on the inside, and he is actually good at making decisions. Now, I myself accept that distinction to a large extent. But accepting that distinction still leaves you with a crisis, because theatrics, presentation, are an absolutely central part of the presidency, for goodness sake. The president has to cultivate confidence. The president has to fabricate confidence and optimism. The president has to communicate about what he or she does, right? It's no good doing the CHIPS Act if you can't say anything about it that, strings 4 fluent sentences consecutively, because nobody knows what you're doing. And in a crisis of trust, doing good policies, if you can't talk about them, is actually a calamity, because it's going to undermine the space for future administrations to do good policies by simply electing, in a succession, politicians who are out to break the democratic system. Then you can't do anything. So we can largely accept the functioning versus the theatrics decision, but the problem is that the theatrics is a central part of sustaining the democratic process. There is then a distinction that's a sort of a sibling distinction of this that's often made, and that's between the internal and external. Well, Joe is a bit sloppy on the outside, but inside, in the meetings that really matter, is really good. And this distinction I reject. Insofar as we're talking about Biden presiding over meetings, Biden guiding meetings, Biden pushing, Biden dancing in hot situations on the inside, the answer is he can't do that. Over the last few years, he has not been able to do that. So theatrics matter not just on the outside, but on the inside too. Now, there is then a question about, Vlad, are you even right that Biden made largely good decisions? By which I don't mean decisions that I support. That's a separate conversation. I mean decisions that are procedurally adequate, that aren't brought about by just cognitive fog or evasion or forgetfulness or just incapacity. You can be really high on all of that procedurally and make a fundamentally wrong decision. So I'm not talking about a fundamentally immoral decision. I'm not talking about that. I'm just talking about whether there's a procedural adequacy there that does require, unfortunately, good cognitive capacity. And my answer to that is largely yes, with a but. I think that Biden was very interested in Ukraine, and Biden was very interested in Israel-Gaza. And on these two, I do think his decision-making roughly parallels what Biden would have been like had he had his full cognitive capacities. Now, you might say, excuse me, have you seen Gaza? Have you seen the extraordinary destruction of life and livelihood there that the United States is indirectly or directly responsible for? How do you call that? How come you call that good? Have you seen the situation in Ukraine, that Putin is actually winning against us at the moment? How is that good? Well, the answer is I'm not talking about that. I'm simply talking about whether Biden made decisions as his old self. And on Ukraine, the answer is yes. And on Gaza, the answer is yes. So there is no question of capacity there for me, where I'm sort of getting a lot of alarm bells ringing. Might be other alarm bells ringing, but they're not at the level of cognition obliterating the decision-making process, right? But I think that with a lot of domestic affairs, Biden was fuzzier than it would have been before, and less proactive. So what I would say is that on some very big policy issues, the theatrics collapsed, but the policy decision making was functionally similar to what it would have been like before, whether you like that or not. But that as you move to domestic politics, let's put a sort of a crude placeholder there. Let's say 30% of decision making was poorer than it would have been 10 years ago when Biden was more functional. Now, let's ask another question. How would Biden be if there were a hot KH emergency in the middle of the night and the nuclear crisis he needed to handle at 3 a.m? Well, the later it would have occurred, the worse he'd have been. Somebody might make the case, look, if there's an extreme middle of the night crisis in 2024, Biden would handle it 50% as well as he would have handled it in 2012. But that 50% of Biden in that moment probably may have been better than Kamala Harris, who wouldn't have had Biden's experience, in particular wouldn't have had Biden's foreign policy experience. Yeah, we can debate about that. That's a persuasive claim to make. So I don't think any kind of unbelievable calamity would have occurred if Biden needed to make a decision in the middle of the night. But I do think it was more fragile. And what especially would have been problematic is if there were an acute disagreement in the middle of the night about something, and Biden needed to sort of balance that out and resolve it and lead one party to come to agree more with the other over a critical issue in a matter of minutes. About that, Biden wouldn't have been anywhere near as good in the middle of the night as before. So I think that's sort of a picture of where we are on how the politicking got impacted. Now, was Biden aware of what was happening? And what was it like for him? I think you've got to make an important distinction here. Biden felt sincerely, and indeed even now might feel, which is an extraordinary thing to say, but even now might feel that he could have done the second term. You might say, well, Vlad, Joe Biden has just got a very challenging cancer diagnosis with which we wish him well. Now you might say, given what you've said about Gaza, do you really want to wish him well? And the answer is yes, I do. Got to keep two things in mind at the same time and also understand the extraordinary difficulty of high politics. But I think Biden right now might even feel, look, if I can do well with this really challenging cancer diagnosis, I might be able to do the second term. You wave a magic wand and get me in there. I have so much confidence in my capacity, even as my capacity depletes. So you've got to make a distinction between Biden fancying himself to go on and do a good job in his mind, and Biden being aware that something is really wrong. A lot of people are out there saying, oh, Biden had no idea something was wrong. He was that delusional. No, he knew very well that something was really wrong cognitively. But he felt that him at 64% of capacity is better than anybody else. And there two dangerous things came together. The pool of power, which is intoxicating once you have it. You don't necessarily want power. Like I'm speaking to you from bed for health reasons. I don't want power, for goodness sake. You probably don't want that much power. But the thing about power isn't that power is the number one thing humans want. Having Joe Biden moment myself. It's the number one and the number two and the number three and the number 17 thing people want once they already have enormous power. And that's why you have such extraordinary psychological perversion, especially in tyrants. You've got Mr. Putin, who wants power more than he wants his family or any of his loved ones. He wants power and power and power and power over everybody, over everything. And the way that lands in Putin's head is not, I want power over the benefit of Russia. In his head, it lands, I want power, and whatever I want is just for the benefit of Russia. So Biden thought, oh my God, this is bad, but oh my God, I've been doing this thing since the 60s. I'm good at it. I'm only getting better. And if my capacities are declining in some significant respects, I can compensate for it by experience and confidence, So what's striking about Biden is how often he appeared in public unable to speak effectively to the American people while feeling utterly confident about what would have just happened having got off the stage. He would have said, screw it, because I've got the capacity to do this job. The optics are bad. I'll give it a shot, make them better. That's a lot of the logic that got him to stay in as long as he did, that got him to stay in until he was essentially kicked out, pressured out. And it was a lot of the logic that got the Dems into a scenario where they were positioning the debate, which ended in calamity for Biden against Trump, as an opportunity to, rescue the election and an opportunity for Biden to catch up. Because the feeling was, he's doing a good enough job. As long as we fix the optics, yes, he can't speak, but Biden is a survivor. Biden takes his chances. When the moment comes, maybe he'll get a few extra words out with a little bit of extra fluency and we'll get over the line because Biden gets us over the line even when he can't speak. How did Biden experience this? Biden experienced this with two emotions. The first is one I've already articulated. For goodness sake, I can just do this. My capacity is depleting. Who cares? I can do this. The other emotion he felt was fear. And it's the kind of primitive fear frail elderly people feel when they're in a space and they can no longer effectively follow what's going on. They've said something, then something is said back to them, but they can't properly register it, they can't properly absorb it because they don't have the cognition to process it, or because they have too much hyperacusis now in the space and everything is a sort of a whir of lights and sounds and they're not quite able to be present and take things in. In a way, elderly, frail people have fear in their eyes. So Biden had fear in his eyes all the time. Now, again, you need emotional intelligence to see this, but for the last few years, every time Biden appeared in public, he just had fear in his eyes. The kind of fear that frail elderly people feel, also the kind of fear you might feel if you were, about to make a jump over a reservoir of water without wanting to land in the water. They just tested your capacity to jump extended enough distance. You're thinking, am I going to do it? Am I not going to do it? Can it happen? Will it happen for me? I'm going to be in the water. And Biden was like that almost before every sentence he uttered in public. So that look of disoriented, somewhat paralyzed fear was always there. He felt that fear, but he also said, for goodness sake, let's just get over myself here because I can just do this and it's going to be okay. Now, and let's just take a tiny rendezvous and even talk about me. So I am in the middle of a very serious and not as yet curable health crisis at the moment. And I am doing something quite extraordinary by speaking to you right now, because I am not able to speak to you the way I'm speaking to you right now for 80% of the day. I'm taking a gamble. I'm speaking to you without a script. I've just written some questions for myself. It's a bungee jump. But what I can't sit here and do, especially with my understanding of how cognitive decline works, 20 years ago, I spent a couple of years not being able to not just walk and talk, but also read and speak. So understand that. I've lived with brain inflammation for 20 years. So what I can't sit here and do and say, look, I have such a great connection with the beautiful community that even if I do 10 chats in a row where I am so incoherent that I don't make any sense, it's all right because I can just do this. Separating out, if you like, the rhetorical clothes of my message from the message itself. But I can't do that entirely. Because if I sit here making no sense, you know what that's going to make you feel, especially if you love me and you follow me and you rely on a kind of epistemic equilibriumization from me, it's going to make you terrified. Because if Vlad is part of your sort of epistemic rudder system and Vlad is off with the fairies, that's terrifying to you. So, yes, of course, I can compromise extensively on how coherently I'm able to speak with you. Yes, of course, it's possible for me to go slowly. It's possible for me to use the fourth preferred word when I can't remember the first, the second, or the third. I do this all the time, by the way. But there are certain minimal thresholds whereby if we cross them, I'm scaring and confusing you more than I am actually giving you something, right? So even with something as casual and gentle and removed from the dynamics of power that as what we have here, not entirely removed from the dynamics of power. The power of persuasion is a social power too, but even what we're doing here does require certain minimal standards of rhetoric and delivery for us to have the kind of emotional connection that we have. I am sometimes, when I'm very sick, prepared to do videos that are just emotional placeholders. Sure. And if my health doesn't improve or gets worse, I'll do that more. I'll literally turn on the camera and give you an impression of my emotional state relative to a world event to help you place that event in some kind of schematic context of high alarm or relative calm and reassurance. So that's also possible. But I've got to be aware of what I'm doing, and I certainly shouldn't come here and try to give a 7-point talk about some matter in culture or politics and make no sense and think that that's okay. No, it's not okay. It's going to make you alarmed and uncomfortable. Lessons. Well, you guys, if you're Americans, failed. You failed because there was an institutional and cultural failure around calling something out that was real, but was being fluffed or denied. So this is a very big crisis of truth-telling. A crisis in which loyalty among the Dem elite, combined with fatalism, yes, Joe's flailing, but who else can it be? And so we got to not call things out. Loyalty combined with fatalism outweighed truthfulness and democracy. And democracy isn't just about elections. If your democracy is about nothing but elections, you're already a long way toward the authoritarian monarchist ideology that is spreading itself around the globe. Democracy is predicated on elections being ensconced in a context of discursive meaning and discursive richness. Countries talking to themselves about themselves. Countries talking to themselves about themselves with their leaders, something that Joe Biden couldn't do. And folks were not calling this out. And it's still happening. There are still people who privately believe, people high up in the Dem Party, who privately believe that Joe Biden wrecked the 2024 election for the Democrats. Not to say they would have won without him, but that they could have won without him if he had stepped aside earlier. Who are still saying he did nothing wrong and are praising him and so on. If you care about aligning with your own side consistently against truthfulness your own side will eventually lose, because democratic practice becomes untethered when your democracy becomes untethered from the practiced virtue of truthfulness. The cultural commentary here that matters is that in part the elites failed here because of how weak and scared and passive they were. It's fear to say we can have a robust debate about what's wrong on our side and still try to win. It's fear of the Trump phenomena, which isn't just a kind of political train coming your way, but it's a train coming your way that doesn't make sense. And part of the reason it doesn't make sense to many of the Democrats is that they helped cause Trump over the last few decades. So this story with Biden is a story about not a kind of cover up whereby a very strong elite did a move on the country, but rather a kind of cover up whereby a very weak and very pathetic and very epistemically confused elite confused themselves about reality for the most part, and to a lesser extent deceived the country. There is a journalistic failure here too that's very important. And the texture, actually, as Klein analyzed this recently, the texture of the journalistic failure here is that podcast bros who are wrong about 78.3% of things they say and who have no access to politics were able to call out lucidly Biden's cognitive decline. But a lot of the journalists with access weren't. And part of the reason for it is that the situation was so clear, you didn't need any access or any specialist knowledge to see it. Whereas a lot of professional journalists were constantly in touch with, folks in the Democratic Party who were saying, yeah, it doesn't look as bad on the inside. We're actually, looking pretty good. Joe's performing reasonably well, and all we can say is that overall the outside appearances are misleading about what's really in on the inside. And you need to have a kind of rudder and clarity and confidence to say, well, I don't care what you guys are saying here because the situation is clear enough. Let me then say something very brief before we round up about my conversation with you about this. So it might be on private mode, but I did share that video within another video on the chat channel. I made a video, I think, in 2019 or 2020, before I was regular on YouTube, saying Biden shouldn't be running because of cognitive decline. I made a couple of cognitive decline videos in 2022, 2023 about Joe Biden. And the backlash from the beautiful community was significant. There were people who knew nothing about cognitive decline or stutters, lecturing me about how all I was really pointing out was a stutter. There were people pointing out that I was exaggerating. And I got an enormous amount of negative direct correspondence, and many of the most popular comments on YouTube under these couple of videos I made were all video comments saying that I was wrong, even though I couldn't have been wrong because the case was so clear. So this was effectively thousands of people getting in touch with me saying that the swan in the middle of the pond wasn't there, even though it plainly was. Self-deception, especially when it conveniences your side, is one of the most distinctive characteristics of human social life. Understand that. And when you self-deceive in order to iron out unlovely things on your side, the medium-term effect of that is almost invariably not that you squeak over the line because you've, papered over the cracks on your side. It's actually that you end up losing. because you don't have enough of a sense of reality. So it's worth noting the extent of denial about Joe's cognitive decline historically, even in this community. And now that Joe's gone from power, that denial has almost evaporated. Interesting, right? Note that there'll be other situations where you might be caught up in patterns like this, and watch out for it. Now, you might say that the positive news here is that eventually the Dem elites pushed Biden out. But I would say that the way he got pushed out was so late and so poorly organized that this gives us an impression not of an effective elite, although it's more effective than if they hadn't done it at all, but of a kind of a late Soviet-style elite that has lost the capacity to be in touch with the country it's trying to run. What are the lessons of this for today? I'm just going to give one. You have to call things out as they are, no matter how fearful you are about the fact that the reality before your eyes might be so stark that you shouldn't name it. And of course, a more important issue than everything we've just talked about is how we talk about Trump. And here I think, in a way, we're mirroring the same faults we've just discussed in journalism and in our public discourse. The vast majority of centrist and center-left journalistic establishments right now are responding to a Trump press conference where Trump makes no sense by normalizing what Trump said. So Trump might say, I've got this microphone here. It's a big microphone, a beautiful microphone. Sometimes microphones are very, very interesting. Sometimes they are not. But we've got a lot of microphones here, many microphones. And some people are saying there aren't any microphones, but there could be many microphones here, but there might not be any at all. The journalistic reports on this would be Trump raises concerns about the issue of microphones, even though it wasn't entirely clear which point he was trying to make. The real report here should be, President of the United States speaks for 7 minutes about microphone, makes no sense. Right? Incoherent, garbled succession of words pronounced by the President of the United States on microphones. That's very, very important. The degree of normalization of Trump's speech right now that's happening is breathtaking. And it's breathtaking because we have a crisis of trust. And elite institutions, including the journalistic institution, are petrified for their future. And individual journalists within big journalistic institutions don't know how to conduct themselves. So at the private dinner after, they're going to say, oh yeah, Trump spoke garbage. But then why did you say in your report that Trump raised an important issue, even though it wasn't fully clear which point he was trying to make? And then you perhaps maybe even gone on and claimed that he was trying to make one kind of coherent point, but in fact he wasn't. So you can't separate democracy from truthfulness, we've been saying. But now let's also say, to round ourselves up before we go into the other oxygen machine and increase our volumes and say goodbye, you can't separate truthfulness from boldness. Playing defense, being passive, being in retreat is incompatible with truthfulness. And we need boldness to keep truthfulness alive. And we need truthfulness to keep, you know what, nearly everything that we love socially and culturally alive. Bye for now, beautiful community.